So today our presentation is going to be on resume critique. We will be talking about how you can use some of the tools that we've been sharing over the past couple of months and make your resume just that much better. And if you would like to join our conversation today, we are tweeting this, and it is #IL workNet or #resume, and we will be following the tweets down the road. Today our panelists are Sarah Martin with AmeriCorps' LIFT project at the Chicago Pilsen office. She has done some great work with the resumes from our previous webinar on Tuesday, and I'm sure she has as equally great information for our webinar today. Myself, I'm Dee Reinhardt. I am a social media strategist with Time to Market. I have been hosting these webinars for us over the past few months. And today, DeTanya Gooden, who is our business services specialist at the Chicago office of Illinois WorkNet, put together the presentation and coordinated this for us today. So I want to thank DeTanya for helping us through this process. I'd also like to thank Lacey Pollock, Chelsea Jones, and Natasha Telgar, who are going to be manning the chat pod, the back end, and our Twitter feeds today. It really does take a village to run one of these webinars. So thanks to everybody. Today our agenda is going to be a discussion about whether or not the resume is really dead. We're going to talk about some first impressions, what you can do with your resume appearance, what kind of a writing style you need to have, the sections, if something is relevant, and then we're going to do an actual online resume critique. So let's dive in and see what we've got going on. So Sarah, in all of this time of digital age, is the resume dead, or do we still need a paper copy of a resume?
So, Dee, the resume is definitely not dead at this point. It has changed a bit, so there are individuals who don't ever have that paper copy per se, that it is an electronic file, but it is still very much a resume. As we've said, there have been some changes that have made to this, that in the past you might have been able to have that one paper document that really summed up your work history that you were able to share with any and every employer that you were interested in. And that part doesn't really exist anymore. Employers are really expecting your resume to be tailored. There isn't that cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all resume. Resumes look a little bit different from individual to individual and industry to industry. And instead, because it's a little bit easier to make since it is electronic and it is easily editable, they're supposed to be industry-specific and tailored. They're new kind of unique documents that are being used to apply for jobs.
And if you notice, there's a couple of things on the tombstone heads over there, AOL, cassettes, CDs, DVDs, and the resume. So we know that the resume hasn't died yet, but it's getting ready to get buried, right?
It's evolved. What it looked like 20 years ago is not what it looks like today, but it is still holding on as a very key document for your job search.
Right. We have 15 seconds at the most to make a good first impression with our resume. Let's talk about resumes, but then how do we deal with automatic resume readers?
Yeah, so if somebody's looking at your resume, that first glance is going to be about 15 seconds, which is why that first impression is very important. The idea is that it needs to have some original appearance. If you use a template as a starting point, that's perfectly fine, as making a resume can be a bit intimidating from scratch, but then you want to take some time to personalize it and really make it look unique. It needs to be visually appearing. That means you need to have clear section headers. You need to have ample white space. White space makes a resume a lot easier to read. You don't want to overdo too much text because that can be a bit overwhelming for somebody. It needs to look professional, regardless of what position you're applying for. Professionalism is very important. One thing that can really help with that first glance might be a qualification summary, which is usually found at the top of your resume and really gives a very brief overview of all of the qualifications you're going to explain a little bit later on in the resume. And then it's very important that the appearance is appropriate to your career level. So a resume for somebody who's applying for an entry-level position is probably going to look a little different for somebody who's applying for upper-level management. The length might be a little different. Your headings are going to be different. So you want to make sure that they are appropriate.
Good, 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 good. We're going to move on to the next slide right now, and I want everybody to take a look, and then we have a polling question for you to answer. So, looking at resume 1 and looking at resume 2, which one to the audience is more visually appealing? All right, it looks like number 2 is in the lead by a lot. Yeah, I think it might be a landslide there, Sarah. What do you think?
It looks like number 2 is definitely winning.
So let's talk about this while we've got the screen going.
Yeah,
Number
so
one,
these are
it's cute, but
exactly. It's a very attractive set of infographics. This person clearly knows their graphic design industry, that they've used kind of some of those key selling points in their resume, but it doesn't look like a resume, and it doesn't really contain the information that you would need to have present in a resume. This is something that would be great as part of their portfolio to be included to really demonstrate some samples of their work. Whereas the graphic design resume number 2, you can still see that they've got some graphic designer flair on there with their, personal logo and that splash of color, but they've also included their information that is needed when somebody's trying to judge what this person's experience and work history looks like. So it's just a little bit more easy to read, a little bit more of a kind of strong selling resume piece as opposed to the designer resume number 1 that looks a little bit more like a portfolio piece.
right. And like we've said, the resume number 1 is a nice additional piece, but it should not be the primary piece.
Exactly.
Okay, here's another opportunity for you to look. High school graduate, resume number 1 on the left, resume number 2 on the right. Who would you call for an interview? Vote now, vote now, vote now. It's almost like American Idol. Okay. Landslide.
Very much.
Landslide. All right, so let's talk about these.
Yeah, so I'm glad to see that everybody kind of gravitated a bit towards the high school graduate resume number 2. I think one of the key things here is just the level of professionalism present in one versus the other. The second resume has a lot of information. It's easy to read. It looks very professional and kind of streamlined. The one on the left, you're just a bit overwhelmed by the graphic, I think, that is included there that doesn't necessarily add anything to the resume, and it just is a bit distracting. You're not looking at the experience, you're not looking what they're bringing to the table, and it just makes it look a little bit less professional.
I think so. I think, again, if somebody's trying to get into the different items like we have in the chat pod there, tattoo artist or graphic artist, it's a nice additional piece again, but it really needs to be more to the one on the right. And we will be talking about resumes that don't have a lot of experience in the near future here.
Right.
So our next slide is talking about writing style. We have a lot of things going on. API guide, Chicago Style Guide. There's all different kinds of guides. So what we need to do is we need to figure out what's appropriate for a resume. So Sarah, let's explain this a little bit.
Yeah, so a resume is often unlike any other document you're going to write. It has kind of some official, unofficial rules in terms of what should be on it. Bullet points are still very much part of a resume, starting with strong action verbs that need to be the appropriate tense. If it is a current position, it should be something in the present tense. If it is something that you are no longer doing, you always want to make sure those are past tense. Um, Having those messed up and having errors can be really jarring for somebody who's taking a look at your resume. You also want to avoid I statements. It's just something nobody wants to spend the whole page reading about things I did this, I did that. One of the easiest ways is if that's how you write is you can definitely say a sentence where I hired 6 new individuals for this position and just take out the I part and you can just leave that bullet point to be hired 6 new individuals. And that's kind of the resume format that is used. In addition to
that's also an action verb, right?
exactly, you start off with that great strong action verb, which is very important in the resume kind of lingo still at this point.
And we want to make sure that the dates are correct.
Yes, dates always need to be correct. It is okay to use years as opposed to months if that's going to help offset a gap in employment, or maybe you were only at a place for a short amount of time. That's generally not an issue. And overall, you really just want to make sure that there are no typos, there are not spelling errors, there are no grammatical or syntax errors, because this is kind of the one key representation of you, and you want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward.
Right. And if you're doing this by yourself, you can always read something out loud. Mm-hmm. Read it off of the page, read it out loud to make sure that it actually makes sense when you hear it in your voice, in your ears. And then the other thing that you can do is ask someone who doesn't know exactly what you do to read your resume to see if it makes sense. If it doesn't make sense to that person, then you need to rework what you've written because then a hiring manager, you don't have to worry about if it's somebody screening the resumes or not.
Definitely. That's a really important thing to remember, that you might be, your resume may be read by somebody who's in HR and not somebody who's in the field that you are applying for. So you do need to make sure that they're going to be able to understand and connect with the experience that you're trying to represent on your resume.
Okay, we have a question from the audience. What is syntax?
Mm-hmm.
That?
Yeah, so it looks like Detonia answered part of that in there, that the okay. Form and flow of your sentences. Some of it is just making sure that, and as we said, resumes can be a little bit difficult because you're actually not writing in standard English for parts of it, but it's making sure your verb tenses are matching up, that your subjects and verbs are matching up, and you are following the standard rules for English.
Great. Okay, resume sections. We have some of these items have been covered in our resume webinar that we did earlier in our series, and Chelsea will put the link up for us so that we can have you watch those resumes webinars if you would like to. But what we want to do right now is we want to talk about sections and format. So Sarah, if you would explain to the audience what's going on with those.
Yeah, so a resume should have very clearly labeled sections. Some of the standard ones are your contact information will be at the top. You'll usually have a section that is labeled for your either a summary, potentially you might have an objective. You'll usually have experience, so whether that's work history or professional experience. You'll usually also have an education section and maybe an accomplishment section. There are definitely, every resume is a little bit different depending on your own personal history, but those are some of the standard ones that you see pretty often on resumes. And then just as there are different sections depending on the resumes, they're also in different orders. You always want to highlight your strongest credentials first. So as we said, you've got that first 15 seconds, and they may not make it all the way through your resume. So you want your strongest assets to be at the top to encourage them to continue reading. Which also brings us to that last point there, that you have to decide which format is best. You can choose between a functional resume, a chronological resume, or there's also the combination resume, which uses both functional and chronological elements. We tend to recommend functional resumes for individuals who have had one position for the last 20 years, who have only had very similar positions, so there's not a lot of difference between their previous 3 jobs. Or somebody who's got some big gaps in their work history that they're trying to cover up. This tends to be the functional, and the chronological is more the standard that people are very familiar with when they think of a resume, listing your most recent position first and working backwards.
And Debbie asked about an objective on our
Mm-hmm.
resume, and we're going to actually talk about that coming up in the very near future, right? So we'll, if you don't mind, Debbie, we're going to put that question off until a little bit later.
Mm-hmm.
So here's the actual sections that most people have, and the one I'd like for you to really point out is the honors and activities, and
Mm-hmm.
then if you want to discuss the other sections as well.
Yeah, so as you can see down at the bottom is the honors and activities, which is not on everybody's resume, but can really help serve a key point if you fit a specific kind of population. Usually if you're a recent graduate who doesn't necessarily have a long work history, but likely has some honors and activities they've participated in, that can go in that section there. It can also be listed for individuals who are recent graduates from college who have that same history, or it can be included if you've been recognized at work and you've received awards. Um, you have some key memberships maybe in some local organizations. You can include those in there because they do help serve to highlight some of the skills that you may have that don't show up elsewhere in your resume.
Right, right. And then the titles, the objective versus summary might be different, but the summary in most cases gives you bullet point keywords that are going to be read very easily by individuals on your resume, correct?
Yes, so your summary is still using bullet points to make it easy to read and friendly. The objective, there are lots of individuals who say you should have it and lots of individuals who say you shouldn't. Everything about resumes is pretty subjective still. You could have what you think and a lot of individuals agree is a great resume, and the HR individual who looks at it disagrees. That's just one of the unfortunate realities of resumes at this point in time. If you do include an objective, you want to make sure that it is a strong objective, that it makes sense, it is adding something to your resume. I tend to encourage it the most when somebody's previous work history is not directly in line with the current job they are applying for, and they're just helping make that connection again for the employer of why their previous history is useful for this new position.
So that's a good point for our job seekers who have been through workforce investment training to
Mm-hmm.
change skills to a totally new career path. They can use that objective area to point out some of the transferable skills that they can bring with them along with their new education.
Yep, it's like a thesis statement for your resume. It's going to be one sentence summing up exactly what, the whole point of this resume is.
Very good, very good. Relevance. Remember that the people that are reading your resume are trying to figure out what's in it for me if I'm going to hire you. So as you're talking about this, we want to do the same thing with a resume that we want to do on LinkedIn. We want to make sure that it's packed with keywords, and keywords are just as critical to a resume as they are to a LinkedIn profile.
Mm-hmm.
So when somebody is trying to explain on their resume, we want to make sure that they can answer things like they can solve problems, they can make you money, or they can save you money. But what else is important as far as relevance goes?
Yeah, so one of the biggest things that I recommend is when you're applying for a job that you have their job description and you try to match that as much as possible to your resume. So if they're looking for somebody who has problem-solving skills, 6 years of experience in team leadership, whatever words or keywords or phrases they're using, you want to make sure that that is also in your resume. It needs to support that job listing as much as you possibly can. You also want to make sure that you're including things that are relevant in the industry, in the general career field. So if you have a position that you don't need to include on your resume that was maybe from 15 plus years ago that doesn't add anything to your resume, you want to leave that off. You want to make sure that this is streamlined and focused and relevant to that specific HR manager and that specific position as much as you possibly can.
Right. And then again, we've mentioned awards and affiliations here and professional certifications. They need to be appropriate to the job for which you're applying.
Exactly. So even if you were CPR certified and it has nothing to do with the job you're applying for, it's great that you have that certification, but it's not adding anything to your resume and actually may confuse the hiring manager as to why you put that on there. So if you have official, professional certifications that are relevant, include them. If they aren't relevant, they're not going to add anything at this point.
But take a look. We've got another couple of poll questions for you. Tell us which job you think that the people are trying to apply for. And we've got our questions backwards. So the one on the right, all right, we're going to move them here real quick. All right, the one on the left, what position are they applying for? And the one on the right, all right, it looks like the audience might be getting this right with that fashion designer.
Yep.
And then for the one on the left, while we're waiting for people to finish the polling questions, we have a question from Vanessa about most of her good experience was in law firms and government, but it's over 20 years ago. How can she incorporate them into her resume now?
All right, great question. There are two kind of general practices that you can do. The first one is you can go with a functional resume format where you're highlighting, you're breaking your resume down based on your skills that you have, and then you're just very briefly listing your work history. So it is okay to include things in that functional skill set that didn't directly come from a position that you list down in your work history. So that's one way that you can address it. The other way is you can also have a section on your resume at the end titled Additional Experience, and you can leave the dates off of it. And you can include then those positions that you feel are very relevant to the job that you're applying for that are maybe over the kind of past the period where you'd like to put the dates on. So those are two general ways that you can make sure that that experience is still on your resume but isn't going to be detracting from what you're trying to sell.
All right, so it looked like we had an office administration position for the one on the left and fashion designer at 100% for the one on the right. So let's talk about the differences between these two resumes here.
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things is we can see everybody felt pretty confident that the one on the right was a fashion designer. So on this resume, we've got the work history listed, the experience listed. There's a great use of white space and headers, and things are broken up. And they've included, a graphic here that is relevant to their industry, that is highlighting their skills to draw sketches. Um, so this is something that really highlights what they're doing. The one on the left looks very creative, but we don't really know what they're applying for. There's not information on here. We're not sure who this person is, what they've done, or what they want to do. So once again, this really focuses on needing to be, this could be, once again, a portfolio supplement if this is somebody who's doing graphic design. Or if they are applying for office administration, this is not really the ideal resume format that you're going to want to use because it's not helping the company understand what skills you're going to be bringing in.
Yeah, it's cute, but again, it's one of those supplemental pieces that could be used as a marketing tool, but it's just not effective.
No.
Okay, resume critique. What we're going to do now is we're going to actually dive into a few resumes and we're going to take a look at the resumes. These were all submitted for live on-air critique. We hope that the information that we're going to share with you is useful based on the information that we have coming out of the resumes. Again, both webinars are going to be recorded, so if you want to watch the one from Tuesday to get different tips versus what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about some basic resumes and then a couple of advanced ones. So moving forward, we're going into our May 9th resumes. And again, if you have questions, please add them to the chat pod. The first resume that we're going to talk about is about a recent high school graduate. And a lot of times high school graduates just don't have a lot of work experience. So how can they take care of this on their resume, Sarah?
All right, so there's a few strategies. As we can see here on this resume, there's too much white space for kind of the content that's provided, so we want to flush that out. One of the first places that you can start is, as you can see on this resume here, that they've listed that they do have some leadership experience from their, as a board member for the student-run club. So as part of that, most likely they had some additional tasks and responsibilities that they did. Maybe they helped plan the events or recruited members or even did simple things like took minutes for the meeting. You can treat this position just like you would a paid job. It's still experience. And so it can have bullet points underneath it, fleshing out what your accomplishments were. Maybe you were the best board member that this organization had because you increased membership by 50%. Whatever that might be, you want to spend some time kind of expanding on it. Same thing even with an activity such as band. There are always transferable skills that are, developed from activities such as this. So maybe you learned great time management skills. Maybe you also had a leadership position as you advanced throughout your time in band. You want to spend some time really asking those questions about what did I do, what additional skills did I gain from this, to really expand on your accomplishments there. In addition, you can, even if you didn't have a traditional paid job, most likely you did something in the summer, such as maybe you helped mow the neighbor's lawn, or maybe you attended a camp and served as a camp counselor one year. Maybe you babysat for your neighbor. Those are some things that you do. You do have the option to include on your resume as a recent high school graduate. If, as an absolute worst case scenario, you have no kind of work history, you can always move into that functional format because you picked up some skills and had some experiences, even just from your school work or your life in general, that will be relevant to your next job. So you could include functional resume headings such as organizational skills or interpersonal skills. How did you do group work while you were in school? Technical skills. What computer programs can you use? A lot of students at this point have great computer skills, so what programs can you use? Maybe communication or problem solving. So there are still ways that you can get content on your resume, even if you don't have an extensive work history.
Good. I think this is a great start and great information for students that are just coming out of high school. So thanks for sharing all of that with us. We're going to move on to our next resume, and we're going to open this up here in just a second. Okay, we got two people driving. Did Tony go on? There we go. All right, this resume is for John Smith. And a couple of things that we noticed here on this resume is that it just, there's something off on this resume for me. And what I think we noticed was, Sarah, go.
Yeah, so the first thing that I see when I just look at this resume is that there's not a whole lot of content on it. If you look at it, it's very easy to read. There's great use of the headers and the lines. Just want to draw your attention quickly to, this is exactly what we talk about when having headers and using some additional formatting to make your resume really easy to read. And then one of the downsides, though, about how easy to read this resume is that your eye is kind of drawn to the fact that this resume does go back past that 10 to 15 year mark. And there's not a lot of information on here about what they accomplished in these positions. There's only one key description underneath each, which just leaves you wanting more, having more questions about the individual. And they have the space, fortunately, on this resume to add some more content to it.
So what I'm seeing, though, is the date is first instead of potentially the name of the company or the type of position that it was.
Yes, so typically at this point, dates that we can see are listed right here are typically located over on the right-hand side of the page. Instead, what would go here would be the organization name, and then the city is usually listed in the middle, and then the date is listed over on the right-hand side.
Right. So what's good about this is the fact that they have the skills listed at the top, but I agree with you that, for example, on the second position, the
Mm-hmm.
just an expansion of some of what those office assignments were. Were you answering phones? Were you filing? Were you doing basic documents? The just embellish upon what some of the chores were that you were doing, how you helped the employer save money or time. Now, what we do want to address here is the gaps in employment. We
Mm-hmm.
see a couple of years here and there. Um, let's talk about how somebody can fill in some of the gap area.
Yeah, definitely. So there's a few gaps going on here. One of the standard ways to fill them in is, well, the first thing to ask yourself is, what were you doing in that time? Um, Were you volunteering somewhere? Were you taking classes to improve your education? Were you working as a caregiver to family? Whatever that may be, if it's appropriate, you can fit that on your resume. You want to make sure that it's in a professional manner. So, for example, if you had to take time off to care for an ailing parent, call yourself a caregiver. And just as there are people who are paid to do that position, you can include the activities you did as if though you had been somebody who had been hired. So that can go on there. Education can go on there. Volunteer work can go on there, which may help cover that gap. If you absolutely have nothing to fill that in, my general recommendation is to switch it over to a functional format where you get to list your skills that you're bringing to the table first to catch the employer's eye, and you're moving all of those dates down to the bottom.
Good. And then one thing that I want to ask about, is it important to put the GPA on, just here under the education it has GPA, is that important to include on a resume?
So it depends a bit on where you are in terms of your education. If you are a recent graduate and you had an outstanding GPA, by all means go ahead and list that. If your education was 10, 15 years ago, your GPA is not as relevant. What might be more relevant is, did you have coursework that you did that applied to your current job? Did you work on any projects that were great, project work or things of that nature? What did you do there that is going to now contribute? Because your GPA becomes a little less relevant over time.
Great, great. All right, let's move on to the next resume, and we've got this one opening up here, and we're going to expand it here. We've got Jane Smith, and Jane Smith's resume also has some spotty work history and a little bit of gaps in employment. So what could she do, what could Jane do to make this resume more effective to help her get hired?
Right. So the first thing that I see when I look at this resume is the fact that we've got paragraphs. So we can see here one of the very first things that catches your eye is that this is a paragraph of text. This can be very intimidating because HR does not have time to sort out the points that you are looking for. So breaking that down into bullet points is really important, making sure that you're doing the work for the employer because you can't expect the employer to do that work for you. So that's one of the very first things. The second would be, it's hard to tell on this resume right here as to whether or not the education that they received helps break up maybe some of that gap that exists in their work history. So if that's the case, that it does, if this occurred in between that gap, by all means, that information should be on there to show that you were doing this information, or you were doing this education or this experience instead of work. So that's how you can kind of help cover some of those gaps. Um, One of the things that we do have here that can be really important, as we mentioned, is that summary of qualifications. However, on this resume, it's at the end of the resume as opposed to the beginning. So my first recommendation would be bullet point this to take it out of that paragraph format and bump it up to the top. That's what you want to kind of lead your resume if you're going to have it on there.
And then also I see in their skills, which
Mm-hmm.
Windows 7 and Windows XP are both skills that can be used, but it doesn't matter where you use them. Supervisory
Exactly.
experience it can be sales supervision, it could be cashier supervision. Just list some of those things out as skills that you own, but maybe not necessarily as jobs that you have had. And again, we have in here raising children, being a domestic engineer, for lack of a better word.
Right.
Domestic engineers have a ton of skills. They have to have time management. They have to have budget skills. They have to have all sorts of things available to make their house run. So those skills are all valuable to employers in some form or fashion.
Right, and if somebody's concerned about how to fit those on, that summary of qualifications is one area where you can add in those additional experiences that you have, whether those are skills you've gained from taking care of your family or taking care of your parents or your children, but you can also move over to that more functional format. This resume I actually think might be a really great candidate for that because the experience that listed is all kind of tax preparation focused, and then in that summary of qualifications, we get a glimpse of some of the additional skills that they bring to the table. And especially since they're applying for a customer service position, I think a functional resume might really highlight why their previous experience makes them a great fit for that role.
Good point. I also think that this resume could fit onto one page if some of these changes are made. The address can all be made smaller. The margins can be made larger. The font can be a little bit smaller.
Yes, that's
Let's talk right now about font.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a great point that you just brought up. I had a note here to talk about it, and I almost skipped it. When I was looking at this resume, it's a size 14 font. 14 is a little bit too big for what you want to do. Your range generally, and this depends on the font because as we all know, each font is a little bit different sized. Something between 9 and 12 is your standard for the content. Your header, so your name, and your headers can be larger. I always recommend your name being the largest thing on your resume because you want everybody to know who you are. And your headers can also be larger than size 12, but the standard content such as this here should not go larger than that size.
Right. All right. Okay, so let's move on to the next resume. We have our next resume coming out here, and this is Jane Doe. So let's talk about Jane Doe's resume.
All right. So this resume here, on a first glance, definitely is a bit more what you think of when you think of how a resume is going to be laid out. There's specific headings that we've got going on. We have bullet points being used. We have some different formatting. But when you get a little closer, there are just a few minor changes that I would recommend to just really make this resume shine a little bit. the first thing that I would start with is right here with this strengths and qualifications section. They're quite varied in this section here. We've got something focused on, a long sentence about interpersonal skills developed from dealing with grief. We have that the individual is a notary public. Um, so if you do have a variety of strengths and qualifications, which a lot of individuals do, you can also theme this section still. You can break them down, maybe use two columns instead, so you would have a series on the left and a series on the right that are a little bit more related, that are grouped together to make it a little bit more comprehensive for the individual. So that would be one of my first suggestions. The second thing that I kind of noticed when I was looking at this is that they are currently employed at this location, but they listed their education first. I think at this point their education is okay to be listed down at the end of the resume, and that this current employment only has one little phrase alongside of it, and I would really recommend expanding on that. What are you doing here? What have you been bringing as a contribution to the company that hasn't really been highlighted or explained?
The one thing that I noticed on this is the version that I got, the
Mm-hmm.
top margin is very large. And
Yes.
so there's white space is our friend. That's a design function, but in this
Mm-hmm.
case, I think the margins are off just a little bit. And by moving some of these things around, I think this is a good possibility of making this a little bit more concise. And what I also noticed was some consistency in the bold versus unbold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they have like it was started here with the headings. I would change this formatting a little bit, having the date and then the company and then the title is a little bit unusual. Once again, we usually have those dates over on the right-hand side, and then the company. And usually instead of putting your title in parentheses, I generally recommend putting it on the level beneath the company name to help stand out, to make it a little bit easier to read. But importantly, very much importantly, is that there was some consistency here in terms of what was going where. That for each of the locations, the title of the individual was in parentheses. So that consistency is something that I can't stress enough. Is that you want to make sure that if you are using bolding, you are using italics somewhere to identify, that you want to use that consistently throughout your resume. And then one final thing that kind of, when I looked at it, I guess two final things that confused me a bit is we've got this position listed down here after accomplishments. It's not in chronological order. I'm assuming it looks like because this was a volunteer position as opposed to a paid position. You have two choices. You can either change your title from work history to just professional experience or something along those lines, and you can then include this in the chronological history. Or you need to add a new heading to identify this as being a volunteer position, because it gets very confusing as to why this one wasn't included. Just want to touch very briefly on references are expected at this point if the employer wishes them, so you don't need to take up space on your resume saying that they'll be provided upon request. That's one of the few things of the resume that has become pretty universally outdated at this point. And then lastly, the last thing I just want to touch on is we do have an accomplishment section here, which can be great. Um, I generally recommend, if you were on the dean's list, that you attach that to your education section. Make it a bullet point underneath the specific school you received that at, to just really highlight why these are relevant as well. So the hospice and the Criminal Justice Honor Society do seem to be things that are related to the work this individual is looking for. So those are some accomplishments that you can include.
Right. One question, and it's probably a good point here that we can ask this, is Sherry asked, is it appropriate to have the same amount of bullets for each job so that the appearance is uniform?
So there's some flexibility on that. I generally recommend balance. So it's okay if your most recent position has a few extra bullet points because that's your most impressive one, but you wouldn't want to have a position that has 2 bullet points and then another one that has 8. Um, you want to make sure that they're balanced. So they should all be in the same general ballpark for how many you're including.
And just to confirm verbally for Don,
Mhm.
he's asking if you start your bullet with a verb, should you be consistent with that?
So the general idea is that they should all start with verbs as much as possible. That's kind of the standard expectation. And you want to make sure that those verbs for a position that is in the past are in the same tense.
Good, good. Okay, we've got a resume to look at here. I'm trying to grab it here to make it bigger. And this is Mary Smith. And let's make this viewable here. So Mary Smith has some great work experience. But let's talk about, we need to minimize this one, Chelsea. Thank you. All right, so this is where we started with this resume. And what we're looking at here is, if we scroll down on this, we have a lot of words. A
lot of words.
lot of words.
Yes.
And if we look at this, we go back to 1979.
Mm-hmm.
That is good, bad, or what?
So that's too far back. If this is something that you are wanting to include, once again, that's when you want to have that additional experience heading. But the standard rule of thumb is no more than 10 to 15 years. So you want to leave off those position dates for those that are past that point in your history, and you want to incorporate them in a different format because unfortunately, age discrimination does happen, and you want to make sure that you aren't going to be excluded from a position simply because you included a date on there that allowed somebody to calculate your age.
All right. Okay, so now let's talk about if let's address this one question. What if, and because we don't know exactly what the companies are here, what if you have one position, I'm sorry, if you have one position that's 24 years long, but you've moved up throughout? How do you handle that?
Yeah, so what I do recommend for that is making sure that so you can list the one employer, and then you can break down each of your position titles as if they were a separate position. So you can have, say if you started off at the entry level, and then you moved up to mid-management, and then you moved up to upper management, and now you're a CEO. You can treat each of those individually and list your accomplishments and your duties with those specific positions and the dates for those, which can help. So if say you were at that job for 30 years, you can eliminate that first position, that entry-level position, and only include the more recent titles that you have held.
Good, good. Okay, while we're right here, let's talk about what about self-employment? What happens if somebody has, um, for example, construction here, the question is, how do you fill the gaps when you've been working construction, you get laid off because of weather, or you get laid off because of the downturn in the economy?
So, with self-employment, if everybody is going to have periods where they don't have as many clients, but if you're still working, if you're still soliciting, trying to find employment, you're still doing some jobs, you're still dealing with paperwork or any of those things, you can include that as not being a break necessarily in your employment. So that's something that I would recommend. If you've been working on construction and you've been employed in this industry for 10 years and there's a month where you don't do any work, you don't have to say that on your resume because it's not a job that you started and finished and didn't do again. You've still been involved in that industry for that period of time.
Good. Now let's take a look at, we actually took this resume that we have right now, and we turned it into a new look. So let's get that one up on the screen. And Let's get that one up on the screen. Here we come. And this is what you did with our Mary Smith resume that had a whole lot of words. So let's explain what you did with this.
Yes, so I do want to put the caveat out there first that this was an IT-based resume, and I do not work in IT, so there are probably some errors on here in terms of where things went, simply because this is not my specific field, but it still can highlight some of the different points that we're trying to bring out. So one of the first things that I did was when I was looking at the resume, is that a lot of the experience was past the dates we might want on there. So I still used up here in the top and kind of this professional experience summary that I broke down to be a bit of a functional format. I still included some of those experiences from there because you can do that on a resume, but I did not include those dates in the work history. So that can be one way if you have that predated experience that you'd like to include, that you can still do that. Um, the individual had two different kind of main themes running through Mary through her resume. One of them were the technical skills. So in here, I just tried to focus on some of the very specific project work that she had done, dealing with server installation or support and monitoring and project leaders for very specific IT projects, dealing with document development. And then she also had some really great management experience running throughout her resume, where she was the team leader in designated tasks. She conducted training seminars. This one right here was great that she calculated the staff time that she was able to save through a new process that she developed. And those are the great things to include on there that you want to make sure that are listed. Even if you're not necessarily applying for a direct management position, these are great skills to have because it's important for somebody to understand. We then included this technology summary to make it a lot easier to know what programs that she's able to work with and to make it a lot easier to find and see as opposed to the paragraphs of text that we were able to see on the previous resume. And then we broke down as well here the work history, very simple in terms of the employer, the location, and the dates. And then the education. For this individual, she had not completed her education. She had taken some credits. So one way you can list that is that instead of having a degree date, that you would put how many credits you had achieved towards that final resume. So as you can see, this one's a little bit easier to find the information you're looking for. There's a lot of white space. There's very clear headers. And it's a little less intimidating, I think, than trying to dive in to the way it was before. But there's still great experience on here, and it really can help sell what you've done.
And it's down to one page, right?
Down to one page.
Good job. You did a great job with this resume. And we will be sending this off to the person that's resume it really was so that they can update the information and make sure that the IT terms are appropriate.
Yes.
So that is the end of our actual critiques. I do want to answer some questions that are coming out of the audience. And we have one from Lubia that says, I have heard from some HR managers that it's not always a good idea to write your address other than your city and state because an employer might discriminate against you based on where you live. Is that a legitimate concern?
So I've heard this as well before. In general, I recommend only including your city and state if you're listing this somewhere that's going to be publicly accessible for privacy concerns. Otherwise, if you think that somebody is not willing to hire you because maybe you're not listed, your address is not in the city for the position you're applying for, or something along those lines, I recommend addressing that in your cover letter to help allay any concerns. But I don't personally know of anybody who was excluded or has direct histories of being discriminated against based on where they live in the city. So if you're very concerned about it, you can definitely proceed with the city-state, but that may also ask somebody to question why you didn't include the full address.
All right, and then we have, well, the other point, too, is if you're trying to move to a new area, if you're trying to move, like, from Chicago to Los Angeles or something, you may not want to put your address just because they'll think you live in Chicago and they're going to have to pay for relocation expenses. So it's
Yeah,
kind of a catch-22, isn't it?
Yeah, well, what I recommend doing for that is outlining it in your cover letter. Generally, if your skills and your experience are strong enough, somebody is not going to throw you out simply because you're not located based in the city where their position is. But you can explain that you're willing to relocate, that maybe you're already moving to the city and you'll be there starting April 1st. Something along those lines. Like if you know you're going to be there, you can address that in the cover letter.
Good. All right. Frank asked about, and we kind of addressed this.
Mhm.
Or it looks like he might have been a stay-at-home dad, and how can he include that in a resume?
So I would call him, that can be a personal caregiver, and you can list all of the specific duties that you had that pertain to the time management skills that you needed to develop while you were trying to make sure that your kids were provided for. What I would recommend is searching for some existing resumes for individuals as caregivers or nannies or things along those lines that, because there are individuals who get paid to do the work that you do, and pull out some of those things that you think are applicable. Pull out the bullet points or the duties or the accomplishments that are things that you did in this job, because you can consider that a job.
Good. Abbreviations. Um, DeTanya answered this in the chat, but the
Mhm.
abbreviations really, unless it is something very standard like HR or
Mhm.
IT that everybody understands, you really need to make sure that your abbreviations are not going to be a deterrent if
Mhm.
someone not in your industry is going to be reading it.
Yeah, so that's just one of those balances that you want to strike. If in doubt, write it out would be my suggestion. That if you're
Ooh, that's
concerned that
cute.
somebody is not going to know what that position is, just write out the full word.
If in doubt, write it out. If in doubt, write it out. I like that. I like that. Okay, now we have a question about annual seasonal work. So
Mhm.
maybe you work in the gardening industry where you only mow lawns from April to October, or you're in the tax industry where you only work from February to April 15th, maybe April 30th. What do you do with that sort of information?
So if this is seasonal work that you do annually, I would still list that the years that you have done it. You can add in there that this is seasonal work, that obviously if it's gardening or landscaping or, for example, taxes, that it is expected that that only occurs for specific periods throughout the year. But you can list the amount of years that you have still done that. And if somebody has questions about, well, clearly you weren't working on this in December, you can explain that this is annual seasonal work you do every year. So you're still employed in that line of work, and I would say that it is okay to just list kind of the years that you have been done that, and make sure that you identify it as seasonal work underneath that heading somewhere, maybe behind your position title.
Good. So it is okay to only list the university and that you attended, not that you actually graduated on your resume.
Yeah, it is definitely okay to include that, because if somebody say you got 90% of the way done but didn't get that diploma, you still got the same education as somebody who maybe took that extra class. So it's perfectly acceptable to include a school that you did not graduate from. What you'll want to focus on is what did you learn there that you're taking away? What information do you have what classes did you take? What project work did you do that is relevant?
All right, and then we have a question about employers who are requesting references with complete name, address, and phone numbers. Is this really necessary for references? I don't think it should be included on your resume. It should be an additional piece that goes out, correct?
Yeah. So yes, I recommend creating it as a separate piece, and then it should match the same formatting as your resume and cover letter. So whatever header you're using for your resume should be on both of those supplementary documents. Unfortunately, if the employer asks for the complete name, address, and phone number, you need to include it. It doesn't matter whether you think it's really necessary or not. If the employer does, they're the ones who matter at that point.
And that's part of the following instructions, part of
Yep.
applying for the job. They want to see how well you can follow instructions. It's one of those soft skills that people are testing you on just by what they've asked for.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I think that's all of our questions from the audience. We want to just cover a couple of things here. The key takeaways from this webinar are that you may need to create multiple resumes to fit the needs of that specific job description that's out there. You cannot any longer have a one resume fits all kind of position.
Mm-hmm.
So then as you're looking at that, you need to make sure that your words are fitting into the into the job description. Those words are on your resume. You want
Very
to
much.
view your resume as a hiring manager. What's in it for me? How are you going to answer those questions for that hiring manager? And as well, is it visually appealing to you?
Yep.
Next point, make sure that your resume is error-free. You have to spell check, you have to proofread, you have to, what else can they do, Sarah?
So I always just recommend printing it out, reading it yourself, make sure that you're giving it to somebody else to proofread, and there are people who say read it backwards to make sure that you're catching any errors. Just continue to read it and to make sure that you're catching any things that might be wrong.
Great. And then you want to make sure that it's professionally formatted. And if you need help with making sure that a resume is professionally formatted, the Illinois WorkNet centers in various areas across the state offer free services to help you update and create a professionally formatted resume. You do not have to pay a dime to have one of those areas help you. And Chelsea just put up where you can find a career specialist in an area near you. They'll help you with the formatting. They'll help you change paragraph format to short statements. They'll help you pick out keywords. They'll help you do all of the things that we were talking about today, as well as if you're in the Chicagoland, Pilsen area, you might be able to go down and visit Sarah herself, and you might be able to get her to provide her expertise for you as well for free.
Yep.
So,
If you're in Chicago, you can definitely give us a call. I think our phone number was put in the little chat pod over on the left, and you can give us a call and set up an appointment. And we'd love to work with you one-on-one to help you get your resume updated as well.
great, great, great. So today I'd like to thank you for attending. If you have not filled out the poll questions on the bottom about how you liked the webinar today, we would appreciate you doing that. I would also like to point out that our next webinar is going to be on May 21st and 23rd, and it will be on elevator speeches. How can you develop your 3-word, 10-second, 30-second, and 60-second elevator speech so that you can be prepared the next time you run into somebody at the spur of the moment and share with them what's good about you that might help them hire you. So May 21st and 23rd. We'll see you there. Watch for the posting of this webinar on illinoisworknet.com. Join us in our LinkedIn group on linkedin.com. It's the Illinois Virtual Job Club Network. Join us for great discussions and announcements about upcoming events. So thanks, everybody. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you to Tanya for manning the chat pod. Thank you, Chelsea, Natasha, and Lacey for helping us with all the back end of the webinar. It absolutely takes a village to run one of these webinars, and we appreciate all the help and all the participants. Thanks. Have a great day.